Hello, team, and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video and Silicon Curtain Co stream. And I am smiling like a Cheshire cat from ear to ear because I guess I forget how much I enjoy doing lives. It's great to speak to the audience. I absolutely love audience interaction. It's what keeps me going, and to spend some more time with the Think. Something I've done.
As if. Oh, I know the insincerity there. It's like, oh my god,
No,
week and a half of this, and here we are back again.
Genuinely enjoyed your company, Mr. Fink. And the Fink behind the scenes is something to behold, I must say. So the man has some stories to tell of bygone eras of youthful exuberance, which I certainly got a lot out of. I must also say, Jonathan, as many of my audience will know, I was particularly ill when I was out in Ukraine. A few of us were. We caught some bug that was going around, and it affected my multiple sclerosis massively, as it sometimes does. So when you're ill, your central nervous system, when you've got MS, can be absolutely battered. And there's a couple of days I was unable to walk. And the worst moment of this was when we were in Lviv station, and my body just went to the point where I was like sitting down in the station where we were for like 4 hours waiting for this train from the sleeper from Lviv to Kyiv. And I said to the guys, I don't think I'm going to be able to stand up. I don't think my body's working. And lo and behold, it didn't work. We had to rush in a wheelchair, and we had to get to the train, old Soviet station, no lifts, had to go up these stairs. So we got wheelchair to the stairs, and then it's Jonathan Fink. And I have many arms helping me around Ukraine with all the wonderful people, Mark and Benny and JR and, everyone really helping. But you were the one I leaned on the most, that trip up the stairs. You remember in Lviv station, and that was one of the most physically demanding things I've ever done in my life. Just walk up those big flight of stairs when my body wasn't working. I honestly, the exertion I was putting in, and it's not a physical exertion thing. It's actually your body's not getting signals. So even though I was exerting, the more I exert, it makes no difference. But so thank you, Jonathan. You really helped me.
No, not at all. It's yeah, I mean, what must annoy you is when people make a fuss about helping you, whereas it just seemed to me that just jumping in and helping is the best thing to do, and don't make a fuss about it. Just ask what you need at a particular point. So, but that station was a shocker, wasn't it? That station was awful from an accessibility point of view.
Yeah, and it makes you realise, doesn't it, what a challenge Ukraine has going forward with a nation that's coming from where it's come, 1990s sort of coming into the Western world, if you like, and then sort of catching up with the ideals maybe of the rest of Europe, even though some countries in Europe have very poor accessibility. And this is a very, very hodgepodge kind of challenge for many countries. But Ukraine specifically has this challenge because of there being so many people coming off the back of a war who will be injured, who will have, quadriplegics, people who will have walking issues, and all the types of accessibility challenges that you can imagine. Ukraine will have so much demand for increased accessibility. So that's something they will absolutely have to get to grips with. And that's something that we appreciated very much firsthand ourselves.
What people might not be aware of, there's three of the largest rehabilitation centers in Ukraine, two of which people may have heard of, Superhumans and Unbroken. There is the third one, whose name nobody knows, and in fact I'm struggling to recall it myself as well, but it means that Lviv is a hub for people with disability needs. So whereas there may be sort of bust in, as it were, into the hospitals, they need to get out and they need to get around afterwards, and it's absolutely shocking. I think we committed at this point to get the Ukrainian Minister for Disability onto the podcast, and he hasn't agreed yet. We're going to work with Yaroslav is one of our collaborators to actually reach out and really, I would say take him to task. So what's the plan? Because this is critical. In Kyiv, it was a little bit more accessible. They had lifts on each of the platforms, but saying it's a historic building is no longer an excuse, I think, to not do something about it.
Yeah, and it's really interesting having Yaroslav, who is a Ukrainian woman, PhD student in anthropology, and has a degree in media studies, I think, as well. So really kind of knows her stuff in a number of different domains. And she was with you for most of the time out there, and was accompanying us, and drove in the trucks from the UK out to Lviv, and she was absolutely horrified at Lviv station. She was really angry that to get a wheelchair, that she had to supply her passport, as if she was not going to return it or anything like that. And we were in such a rush, and she had to get the wheelchair all the way back down, all the way, which is a long way. These are huge stations, all the way back to where she got it from, and then get back up to the train. It was all just chaos and
It's a
panic.
bit of a mad dash to get
Yeah.
back on the train, and for it not to miss. But it has to be said, that moment did arrive.
Yeah.
Watching the train depart from the station, and you're not on it. I did have the extraordinary pleasure of that experience. Jonathan, what happened there, Harry? The audience.
Are we talking? Are we talking about when you got detained at the border?
Yes.
This is so. I've got something to show. So first of all, like, for the audience, we on the way back from Kyiv to Lviv, we took the sleeper train again in reverse. Much newer train, actually, much nicer journey, and I could actually walk. So that was good. We went through Lviv and then to the Ukrainian border. And at the Ukrainian border, the customs come on and they give you a cursory check of the bags. And they checked our. There were 4 of us in one compartment, and then a few in the other compartment. And they gave a cursory check of our bags. Nothing to report, even though I had this in my bag.
Wait
in fact,
for
we
it.
had 2 of these. So this is a NATO canister for 7.62 mil rounds, M80 cartons, M13, so on and so forth. You can look at that. This is given to me by Jiggers Paw. Said, you make do with this what you will, type thing. And we took 3 of these away, right? And put them in our bags, thinking they're just metal boxes. They're not going to worry with these. I mean, these are 10 a penny, really. But we had 2 in our compartment. They didn't pick them up at all. Then went to your cabin, into your bag, found one of them. Was like, oh, hello, what's this? Put that out, and then JR had a couple of.
It's an empty metal box, right? It's nothing, it's nothing special.
And then JR had 2 rounds. Like, I don't know what they were, but they were
heavy caliber rounds. Yeah. That, however, is they really don't like those things, and probably more understandably.
Yeah, so they put them to the side, and then they like, oh, whose are these? And because you speak Russian, you're like, okay, they're mine. The box was yours, but the rounds weren't. But you're like, I'll take this, and I'll do all the explaining. And then after kind of like a bit of a conversation, they're like, well, we're going to have to check this out with our boss. You're going to have to get your bags and your coat, and you're coming with us. So Jonathan Fink got marched off the train. The train stayed there for about half an hour. We're thinking, and we were in an internet black zone as well, so we couldn't text him how he was doing, what's going on. Oh my goodness, Jonathan Fink has been detained at the border here. And then the train just slowly starts pulling away, and we're like, oh shit, we've lost Fink. So we were like, oh my goodness. Then we're thinking, what's the worst that can happen? He can slap on his wrist, surely. I mean, this is just anyway. So we then went through to Shemshel on the Polish side of the border. I still had 2 of these, and we were worried about, because they had said to you, and as I'm sure you tell us in a minute, that it's a Polish border that are worried about these, and that's why we want to like hold you to task. But actually, the Polish border didn't care. I put them through like one of those X-ray machines, plonked them down, big clang. It went ding 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 as the metal went off in the X-ray machine. And they didn't give a toss. So then we ended up getting another 2.5 hour train, because we like couldn't contact you as you were out of communication. So we're like, well, we need to go to Krakow, and then we can't just wait here. I mean, we could have done, maybe we should have done, but we went to Krakow, and then by the time we got to Krakow, we're like, eventually heard from you through Twitter of all things, going, yeah, I'm all right. I'm at a station. They made me miss a train. So what's your account of what happened? Because it's 5 hours later, you eventually joined us.
5 hours later, and there's a bit of teasing later. It was quite funny. But no, I mean, if someone, and they didn't speak a word of English there, no one spoke English there, so it would have been really difficult. Might have been worse, actually, if they'd taken one of you, JR or somebody. But anyway, I thought, look, at least I can explain why we've got these. And there was a good reason, not for the rounds of ammunition. As soon as I got off the train, I said, well, they're not mine, but you guys are already gone, so it's okay. Yeah, Dean set me up. And I explained to them, look, this canister, we have auctions to buy drones, and we do frequent events. I couldn't show them because I couldn't get onto the phone, but I explained, look, we'll only take this over because we want to auction it and raise money for Ukraine. And they were like, oh, okay, fair enough. They weren't particularly interested in that. Unlike other border guards, they weren't particularly interested in the fact we're YouTubers and didn't want to take selfies. But our experience at the road border crossing was, selfies with all the customs officers. Here they're just doing the job. They get trains coming in every 2 hours, and I think I get the impression that every train has at least 1 or 2 people hauled off. So they've got a constant round of paperwork and this kind of stuff. So there was a kind of faintly slight ennui about the whole place, and they're just doing their business. It's a hard, boring job. And this place, this customs hall, very kind of Soviet to anyone who's experienced. It was neat and it was tidy or whatever. There was no water. There was no drinks. There's no food. There's no machine. There was a toilet, yes, but there's no toilet paper. And then when you go to wash your hands afterwards, there's no water in the taps. So they really don't want to provide any amenities to anyone who's stuck there. And of course, you're in an internet dead zone. So that wasn't particularly nice. So it took 2 hours really to sort of be interviewed by several people. And the rest was sitting around until the next train arrived. But of course, the train sits at the border for 2 hours. So you've got a 2-hour wait and another 2 hours while they go and they check the passports of that train. So that's basically like that's at least a minimum of a 4-hour extra wait on a hard wooden bench. I had a sore butt, frankly, for the rest of the journey.
And I wasn't just from sitting.
And internet deprived. Yes, Noel. Just to quash any rumours there. They behaved very professionally. And there's a certain Ukrainian black humour as well. So they had to call a senior police person who operates on the site. So I saw the customs officers in sort of, militarized uniforms, etc. Had conversations with them, and they said, the trouble is, blah, blah, blah. The Polish customs create so many problems. We're going to do all this paperwork and blah, blah, blah. Oh, and you have to speak to the police as well. I'm like, oh, here we go. So this guy arrives. We go through it all again, same answers, and he's filling out some kind of tablet with all the details, sighing prodigiously through the whole thing because I've caused him such hassle. And then he looks up at me with a completely straight face. He says, "So what are we going to do with you? Are we going to lock you up and throw away the key? Will you learn from that?" And then there's a little grin that appears on the corner of his face, and I thought, "Oh, okay, nice one." But anyway, I knew I wasn't going to get the train. They explained to me the minute I got off the train, well, that's it. You're not getting back on that one. So that was good. I mean, I could have sat there for 2 hours with the expectation I could get the train, and they couldn't. But and then they told me straight away, right, that train's going. You won't be on it. The rest was a lot of sitting down, and I wasn't anxious really at any point.
Yeah, I love the fact that as well, when you got to Krakow, we forgot to tell you exactly which Krakow station to get off. And just for those who are watching, if you don't know Jonathan, the man can swear, right? He doesn't look like it on screen, but the man's got a potty mouth. And so
that's a terrible libel, that is, Jonathan. I mean, no one's going to believe that from my videos.
Of course. So I phoned him, and he's at Krakow. He's like, "I've got off at the wrong station," and then you told us you got off the wrong station. Then I phoned you, and I picked up the phone. And you're like, FDFFF. I've just missed the train is going off I'm at the wrong end of the station, the wrong end of the platform, and the train that you need. We just sent out a taxi. It's like, oh God, think.
I looked down at my phone. I looked down at my phone for like 20 seconds because I was trying to order a schnitzel via you. I was like, I want a massive beer and a massive schnitzel. And I looked up and realized the train was like 20 meters away at the completely other end of the platform. So I'm running down the platform to try and get it. I've waited for half an hour to get this train into the center of town. I can smell the schnitzel. I can't, but it's just there psychologically. And seeing the train depart was just a a horrible repetition of what happened earlier in the day. I lost it.
I found it particularly amusing. Can I just say, this is James, Wine Ukraine. Hey guys, just back from my deployment, walking home from headquarters. So we met James in the Dream Hostel in Kyiv. Cool to see you guys together live again. And that is the flag that James gave me from a unit that he had provided drones for. That's the 63rd. And there's a tattoo artist has drawn a lovely drone and whatnot on there. So thanks for that, James. Really appreciated. So I'm sure we're going to be littering our talks going forward with anecdotes and pieces of observation and knowledge that we've picked up. Let's have a quick look at some of the geopolitical goings on, if you don't mind, Jonathan. Is that all right?
No, it's been an actual fire hydrant of awfulness since we went away, and yeah, I've been trying to catch up as well.
Yeah, well, Goose Springsteen says, JP, I've been waiting so long for this and scribbling thoughts. Great to see you feeling so much better. I imagine we're going to get a number of questions from Goose Springsteen. Thank you for that, matey. Kevin Forst is gifting some ATP Geopolitics memberships. Thanks for that, as has Richard Demi. Really kind of you guys. And also Johnny Christensen from Denmark. Hey, JP and Jonathan, I told you that Trump would annex Greenland and Canada, so he could be like Polk and Jefferson, love from Langeland, and that's something we're going to be talking about, no doubt. Jonathan MPS, Jonathan squared, indeed. It's not just two of us. We are multiplied in our something that's, I don't know, maths.
He's from a similar pod, it turns out.
Yes, Johnny Christensen says have to go, have a good stream, love from Langland. So thank you very much for that, and we'll go on to a couple of Goose's questions a little bit later. Let's get into some geopolitics. I'm going to bring up some stimulus for us, Jonathan, just to help us through. So we're going to start with the UK, which is also related to, I guess, the EU, our membership of the EU, also related to Canada, Mexico, and possibly the EU and the trade wars that have been started by Donald Trump. So this is Keir Starmer heading to Brussels, urging EU leaders to ramp up pressure on Putin. He'll meet with NATO's Mark Rutte and the EU leaders to push for stronger sanctions and actions against Russia's war machine. And then also, we have Shashant Joshi talking about how the UK-EU discussions on the security pact going, given that we're in a transatlantic crisis and Ukraine is struggling. Quote, the EU has drawn up guidelines to reset that stress an early deal on fishing rights is necessary for moving forward in other areas. So he's like wondering, really, is it all going to be about fishing rights? Although that is quite an important thing. We share security interests with the UK and the UK shares it with us, the EU diplomat said, but at the same time, there is no beating about the bush. The future relationship on fisheries is also very important. But Ian says, more encouragingly, EU governments are exploring ways to include the UK and Norway in a coalition of the willing, dedicated to expanding the continent's defences while circumventing militarily neutral and Russia-friendly capitals. And just one more here. Yes, a coalition of willing. Keir Starmer and Mark Rutte will join EU leaders to discuss rearmament and increasing military capabilities. What are your thoughts on all of that?
This is a tricky one, isn't it? Because I would imagine that both of us are not Eurosceptic, as it were. We were potentially on the Remain side of the debate. And for me, whatever the political debate, it's never made any economic sense to cut yourself off from your geographically, closest market. Every single analysis of economics shows you that no matter what desires you might have for global trade, you can work on those, but the bulk of your trade is going to be with those who are geographically closest to you. So it literally is the most irrational and illogical thing, I think, that was done in the last 100 years. Of course, Trump is rapidly trying to get into first place by starting a trade war with all his allies, which makes even less sense in many ways.
In simple free market economic terms, you don't want to put up what are called barriers to entry to a market, right? So if you start putting barriers to entry, then if you are believing that the free market is the be all and end all, and I'm actually more of a mixed economic person, I think sensible regulation, etc. But the principle is a free market, that you want frictionless trade as much as possible. That keeps costs down, red tape down, etc. well, we need to have that kind of arrangement with our closest neighbors, because actually that's who we're going to be doing most of our trade with. Likewise, and that's why you have NAFTA in the US, between North American Free Trade Agreement between Mexico, US, and Canada, because they are neighbors, and that's who they're going to be doing most of their trade with. And in fact, Donald Trump did that deal, the NAFTA deal. He tore up the previous deal, then reset that with the new NAFTA deal, and now that's apparently not good enough because he's slapping on tariffs, which is the opposite of free trade.
It kind of, yeah, it doesn't make much sense at all. But if we were living in a free trade world where barriers were not the norm, and everyone was lovely and played nicely with each other, then you could say, okay, Brexit's still not that logical, but there are opportunities, etc. But we're rapidly descending into a world of imperialistic blocs, with the US deciding if it can't beat them, join them, it seems, and behaving like one of those imperialistic blocs. This is not a world that is conducive to free trade. It's not the world that was envisaged by the US in the second half of the 20th century. It's not the world that was envisaged by the British when they were at the fore to protect the oceans for trade. That's not to say there are some negative sides to all of these, and it's not to say that Britain and America always observed the rules that they and values that they try to impose on others. But we're rapidly entering a very protectionist, very economically irrational, highly paranoid and defensive world. So to exclude yourself from one of the largest trading blocs in the world, one that still nominally adheres to some of those ideas of the previous century, is madness, because we're not going to find a more conducive environment by trading with China. Unfortunately, Keir Starmer does not seem to understand that. We will not find a more conducive arrangement with Russia, with America, and with others at this point in time. So I think it's madness to ideologically say we shouldn't get close to Europe. Whether we should seek reintegration politically is a far more divisive and complex question. But certainly, some kind of economic arrangement makes sense. But of course, where we are right now, it cannot be economic on its own. There is going to be, and there are conversations about military cooperation. But, I penned this phrase when I was with Joseph Lindsley, at the speed of Ukraine, which implies very fast. You could turn that around and say at the speed of the EU, which is like wading through treacle, and it's monumentally slow. So moving at the speed of the EU is not going to be the kind of pace that we need right now in order to resist Russian aggression. Unfortunately, we need to be moving at the speed of Ukraine, which means, as you said, a coalition of the willing is
I think
what we're going to need.
I wonder whether the EU is speeding up some of its processes that necessarily have to have been sped up as a result of the war in Ukraine. They've had to do certain things much more quickly than they would be used to doing over the course of the last 2 to 3 years. It's interesting that and this is absolutely necessary, that the UK does get a closer military alignment with the EU. But it's also interesting that they're talking about a coalition of the willing that might not also include those kind of neutral countries, your Austrias and your problematic countries like Slovakia and Hungary, more on them soon. So yeah, I think a closer union from the UK, from the UK's point of view, with the EU, I think is economically necessary for growth. I think it has to be part of what Keir Starmer is planning. You can't just rely on growth by trying to attract internal investment away from the EU. Like, if you're a multinational, do you invest in the EU and have free access to 500 million people, or do you invest in the UK and have access to 70 million people and tariffs on 500 million people? Well, you're always going to go to the EU. So the only way you can attract away from them, from the EU, is just prostitute yourself to those multinationals and offer them every single tax break on earth, and then it doesn't become so beneficial for yourself to get that inward investment. So I think we need to have a closer union with the EU, both militarily and economic. And I think that's going to be interesting. But it's going to be fascinating to see whether there will be an alliance between Canada, maybe even going to old Commonwealth times. Canada came to, well, you can talk about Article 5 and Afghanistan and the war on terror and NATO, but we can talk about First World War and the Second World War. The Canadians came and helped out Britain and Europe before the Americans did. We possibly need to return a favor to Canada, to stand in solidarity with them in an economic war with the US. And then we're starting to see the unity of allies of Ukraine fall apart as the West eats itself. And this is just everything that Trump is doing is the wrong thing to do right now. You're on mute. It's beautiful sound.
If you could script this, in the Kremlin, you're sitting in one of those sort of grand renovated, slightly sort of paranoid interiors created by the Tsars and Ivan the Terrible. If you were scripting it there, this is exactly how you'd want it to play out. So the question I always ask is, who does this stuff benefit? Who does it benefit for Elon Musk to eviscerate US government and destroy, in fact, the process of governance, shut down US aid? Who does it benefit that Trump starts trade wars with partners? Who does it benefit that the Trump administration starts insisting that Ukraine holds elections, even though those are illegal under the Ukrainian constitution and impractical in any case? Who does it benefit? Well, in all these cases, it benefits Putin. Now, he may no longer be in a position militarily to really take advantage of this unless he gets considerably more troops from North Korea and kit from China. And it's at the moment, it's not clear whether China is all in with Russia or whether China is actually getting frustrated with all of this. But certainly you could say that what's happened now could easily be scripted by the Kremlin, because Russia is an agent of chaos. Russia is an agent of nihilism. Its business model only works in the vacuum of law and order.
Everything that Trump is doing at the moment, everything that Musk is doing at the moment, 100% of what they're doing benefits Russia. Like each and everything they're doing, as they are taking, I think, the US back, democratically speaking. I think it's a huge, huge problem. Goose Springsteen says, speaking as a Brexit voter, big surprise, right? For me, the question was always sovereignty. I don't want to bore you with this. I gave a public talk. I gave two talks, one debate before Brexit, one afterwards. And the public talk afterwards was about Brexit and the media. And it's really interesting when you look at the stats on sovereignty, like, go and look at the statistics on whether sovereignty was an issue for the British voter, and it was not. Sovereignty was not an issue for the British voter until about 2 months before the election, when people started reading in newspapers that sovereignty was an issue. And then, I'm not saying this is for Goose Springsteen, though, but also the interesting thing, people like James O'Brien always do this on LBC Radio, which is they say, okay, sovereignty, when people phoned into him, he'd be like, yeah, sovereignty, we want the rules back in the UK. And he'd say, okay, name me 3 top rules that you would have migrated back to the UK that at the moment we don't have the right to have, that the EU have taken from us. Give me 3 rules. And not a single person I ever heard phone in to him where he asked that question was able to answer that. So it sounds like, yeah, I'm really big on sovereignty. Okay, give me an example of how we don't have sovereignty. And they go, yeah. So I find that interesting. I'm not saying Goose Springsteen is all like that, though. I didn't want to be part of the European superstate, which realistically is the only way the EU can survive. Now, that's an interesting conversation. It's not, we don't have time for that, but I don't have too much of a problem with a kind of, depends how you describe a super state and whether you do it pejoratively or problematically. I don't have a problem with an EU army because we've got a NATO army, UN army, and like this is just another. I think this would be more beneficial for Europe anyway. Those are other questions for another time. But
the question there, and I have this argument because I do have some smart friends who voted for Brexit, and I do take their reasons for it seriously. And my argument is, well, look, you cannot change the system from the outside. You have zero chance of changing it from the outside. Whereas evidence shows, if you are evidence-led, that Britain has an oversized influence in the structure of the EU, making it into more of a sort of, a trading alliance rather than a political one. And Britain was very able to not just guide the rules and evolution of the EU, but then to take advantage of those. We talked about Britain's extraordinary ability to attract international bodies such as those that govern pharmaceuticals, etc., to its shores, banking, various educational establishments, institutions, the vast number of EU students who came here and brought vast amounts of money with them. But also we were very skilled, more skilled by a long shot than any other country at winning research grants for our leading universities. So to say, we were a poor relation in this alliance and had no say in it, is to ignore all the evidence of reality. Now, that's not to say the EU can't evolve into other things, because we had an influence in shaping and evolving it, and it might not have been perfect to our ends, but you cannot shape and evolve anything if you're outside of it. So that's certainly my angle there.
So talking about the EU, here's another something to discuss. EU Parliament has approved a resolution to combat Russia's use of the historical myths to justify the war in Ukraine. It condemns Russia's manipulation of history, particularly in relation to Soviet crimes, and calls to preserve the memory of totalitarian regimes' victims. This is interesting, this kind of up my street in terms of sort of disinformation. So the EU, what's going on there? Get off. So adverts say, now I've gone and lost that. So we'll go back. Here we are. EU Parliament votes to combat Russian historical myths used to justify war against Ukraine. It votes 480 to 58 to condemn Russia's historical revisionism and Soviet crime denials, linking past atrocities to current Ukraine invasion while addressing social media concerns. I welcome the European Parliament's decision to condemn Russia for its lack of accountability for the crimes of the Soviet regime, manipulation of history and glorification of totalitarianism, said the Speaker of the Verkhovna Rada, Ruslan Stefanchuk, after the document's adoption. So they've adopted this. I don't know what difference that will make in practical terms, but I think stuff like this is really important to move allies in the right direction in terms of stopping disinformation, stopping historical revisionism, which I think is a very dangerous pastime to partake in, etc., etc.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Can you legislate for all of this? Probably not, because the reality of disinformation is too fast moving. So you need a combination of legislating against the most pernicious, hate-fueled stuff, but you also need structural reforms within the media. You need to invest in how would you call it, sort of media literacy, this kind of stuff. So
like they do in
there's a
Finland,
multi-level approach to tackling this. But this is something, this is something to be applauded and studied.
And actually, it's going to be very interesting to see how the EU deals with Musk. And if Musk gets hold of TikTok, as many people still think he's going to be able to, so as they put the TikTok forced sale on hold, as executive order, as one of Trump's executive orders had done. So they were going to ban TikTok, and now it's likely that it'll go back to trying to sell off TikTok to an American concern. If that is Elon Musk, then you have him controlling TikTok and controlling Twitter or X, and you're back to the EU having to do something about that as a form of like controlling for disinformation. And I think that's something they'll be looking to do anyway with regard to Musk. But I was listening to Tommy Vitor from Pod Save America be interviewed by Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart on the British political podcast, The Rest is Politics, and absolutely fascinating. But they were talking about, what needs to happen with Trump and, so-called allies, as we once were. We now seem to be on the receiving end of trade wars, and it's a case of having to stand up strong to Trump. If you there's lots of people going, oh, okay, if we're nice to him, like at Davos, if you're nice to him and you try and do everything he says, then that he'll just take advantage of you. Actually, there needs to be a strength from either the EU, Keir Starmer, Canada, Mexico. There needs to be a strength, stand up to Trump and say, right, that's it. We're not suffering fools gladly. Here's what for. And it could be that for a bit like because I see Trump as very similar to Putin. Like, he's great if you're weak, but if you stand up strong to Putin, actually he doesn't quite know what to do so much.
Yes, definitely. That's peace through strength. I think it's not just a slogan. It's a way that you absolutely have to operate with how should I say it? Those who have more of the gangster, extractive gangster mindset. They live in a world of win-lose. and the concept of a win-win doesn't really register. So if you come in there with that kind of win-win mentality, they're going to literally walk all over you. You have to come in, as you say, from a sort of tough stance from the ground up. And the trouble is, Trump is now in charge of the most powerful nation in the world, both economically and militarily. There's no question. So we've not been here before. I mean, Nazi Germany, and obviously I'm very aware. They say the minute you mention Hitler, you've lost the argument. But Nazi Germany was not the most powerful entity at the time of the Second World War. It was still, in terms of command of resources, the British Empire, with the American the new American century sort of dawning, and very quickly, America eclipsed us. So Germany, in some respects, we like to big them up because we like the underdog, but we were by no means the underdog at all. We were incredibly powerful, resource rich, with a vast navy and human resources we can call upon. We're not in that position anymore, and nor is anybody in the EU, except for the internal populations it has. For many decades now, we haven't translated the wealth that Europe's generated into security, into military hardware that we can use. And here you have America that has a vast arsenal of lethal equipment, and now you have excuse me, an orange-faced lunatic, a narcissist in charge of it. What his actual agenda isn't entirely clear, but certainly he is reveling in the projection of power and will continue to do so. And there's none of the checks and balances that existed during his first term.
Yeah, and I think, talking about disinformation that Russia is able to, these platforms that Russia can manipulate, like TikTok and Twitter, where you are seeing, particularly with Twitter, you are seeing a huge amount of Russian manipulation that's taken place there over time. Europe needs to stand up strong and do something about that. But actually, when we talk about trade war, if there's a looming trade war with the EU is going to follow through on their military strategy, which is that they want 60% of all military equipment procured from within inside the EU. Well, that could be expedited. You might see a real closing of the, circling the wagons in the EU, where they're like, right, that's it. We are now going to go full on in supporting our own military industrial complex, and you might see an eschewing of the American military industrial complex, and you might see some internal lobbying going on with big companies going to Trump. Hey, hang on, mate, what are you doing here? You are ruining relationships with us. We are going to be put on the back foot. Europe are now going to be buying SAMPTs and not Patriot systems. Europe is going to be going to Rheinmetall and not to Northrop Grumman or whatever, and you might have a Europe that then starts looking far more isolated, at least from the US, and that will work against the US, certainly in industrial concerns.
And our message to people who are still clinging to the absolutist view of Britain being outside of Europe and not willing to say, look, there are different levels of engagement that actually some of them might make sense. Do you really want your country? We've been adept throughout history, for obvious reasons, at innovating and building military kit. And that brings in a vast amount of money through the 20th century. Do you really want to be outside of the European trading bloc when it is rearming and, as you say, shifting its investment to stuff that's produced within the bloc? Because we are capable of producing some of the best military equipment, the most innovative military equipment the world has to offer. It would be shooting ourselves in both feet and in the hands and in the head if we stay outside of that process.
It's going to be, I mean, this is a fascinating time. It's like a car crash that you drive past and you just like, it's horrific, but you can't help but focus on it and look at it. And what's going on in the world at the moment is incredibly scary, but it's compulsive viewing where the West appears to be eating itself. And as someone says here, you could get, NATO being sidelined in a more kind of Eurocentric NATO equivalent. You could get Canada, Britain, Australia, you're getting together to kind of become their own sort of loosely connected superpower. I don't know. There's all sorts of things happening. The Commonwealth, former British states and whatnot getting together. So yeah, interesting times ahead. We're going to move on, if you don't mind, now to Transnistria. And Zelensky and Maya Sandu met recently. I mean, this is going back to the 25th. They said they're ready to meet Transnistria's energy needs. So remember, Transnistria, the annexed region to the east of Moldova, had its energy cut off from Russia. They're wanting that energy to be restored by Russia because they're pro-Russian. They don't really want to give in to Moldova and the EU providing energy. So Ukrainian President Zelensky and his Moldovan counterpart said they were ready to meet those energy needs for the region. Then said, welcomed Maya Sandu to Kyiv. Situation with our neighbors is serious, unstable, and only together can we correct the situation, in particular in energy and in many social issues that are used against interests of not only Moldova, but other places too. And Moldova has started supplying gas to Transnistria, according to Europa Libera Moldova. Moldova Gas Company's interim director, Vadim Seban, said that these deliveries started back on February the 1st at 8:30 in the morning. The quantities pumped into the pipeline system on the left bank of the Dniester are sufficient to maintain pressure, so they are now providing. But Transnistria then has later said on the 2nd they may soon switch back to Russian gas. President of the unrecognized republic, Vadim Krasnoselsky, seeks a long-term gas deal with the Russian assistance. Moldova approved 20 million euros for Transnistria's gas, but Krasnoselsky hints at Russian supply via Turk Stream. So there's lots of pushing and pulling with regards to what's going on in Transnistria, and it's all, of course, connected. This is like pure geopolitical 4D chess going on here.
I thought geopolitics, has that come kind of
it's a new word,
new exercise fad, is it?
I've got my own dictionary.
Transnistria is an interesting one because it's not particularly well fortified by the Russians, and there's an increasing let's say intolerance towards the presence of the Russian army there, and in fact it's seen as a point of vulnerability and insecurity in Europe. So I wonder, I mean, whether Moldova will do that. I wonder whether they will get assistance from Romania, which is some of the speculation that's going on, to finally unseat the Russian, let's say, sort of colonist forces that continue to operate roadblocks, and to create, that enclave, as it were, that doesn't adhere to the rule of law or constitution of that country. And it's an interesting question, isn't it? If you acknowledge that we're at war with Russia, then you take these kind of incursions, provocations, and islands of Russian influence seriously, and you would adopt, let's say, a Cold War attitude, the concept of dominoes, which is you do everything you can to prevent Russian influence from increasing in certain countries and certain places. Obviously, according to the sort of CIA playbook, that may include installing, rather vicious and unpleasant right-wing governments that are loyal to you, because that is considered better than a Russian presence being developed. We're not in that mindset yet, but it's an open question for me as to whether we should start thinking in that mode. Not necessarily support anti-democratic governments, because I think that creates more problems and it creates fodder for propagandists as well that can call us hypocrites. But I honestly think we need to start looking at Russian presence around the world and how it can be dislodged, such as it was in Syria.
So we're going to go through Eastern Europe now, and quite a lot to deal with. So I'm going to put it all into one and see what you have to say after that, Jonathan, if you don't mind. So we'll start with Hungary. Orban said that he's against Ukraine's rapid membership of the European Union because it would allegedly ruin the Hungarian economy and NATO, since it would lead to a war between the alliance and Russia. So nothing unusual, stuff we've heard from him before. Hungary is expected to back down from its threat to block the EU from renewing its Russia sanctions after US President Donald Trump menaced Moscow with even more penalties, according to Politico, although he might have gone back on that now. If Orban really blocks European sanctions at a key moment of the war, it'll be absolutely clear that in this big game for the security and the future of Europe, he is playing in Putin's team and not in ours, with all the consequences of this fact, said Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk. So it's very clear to many within the EU that Viktor Orban is really batting for the Russians. Hungary will only support further EU sanctions against Russia after consultations with Trump, says Hungarian EU Minister Janos Boka. He warns that the EU should be cautious and align with the new US administration before adopting new measures. And personally, from my point of view, one of the biggest indications of what's going to go on is going forward is how the US deals with sanctions for Russia. So it's incredibly important to look at that. Now we're going to go to Slovakia. Slovakia is Europe. 100,000 Slovakians demanded the resignation of pro-Russian Prime Minister Robert Fico on the 25th, organized by the NGO Peace for Ukraine and opposition parties. The protest took place in 30 cities, as well as Poland, Germany, Czechia, and Ireland. They have been ongoing since early January in response to Fico's anti-Ukrainian stance there. So really good to see Slovakia coming out in a greater force, actually. And a Putin visit, obviously, from Fico that annoyed many. Fico, in turn, claims that Slovakia faces an orchestrated attempt to destabilize its government, warning of a Slovak Maidan as part of a sinister foreign plot. But these are some absolutely massive protests, which is really good because there have been much smaller protests previously. But yeah, protests against pro-Putin traitor Robert Fico in Bratislava there, and that's going back 9 days again, so quite a long time back. But there have been these rumblings I've been unable to report on. Slovak Prime Minister Fico continued to make statements about Ukraine, saying that Ukraine will never join NATO and the EU membership is in question. Very similar to Orban here. Fico also suggested that Ukraine will lose a third of its territory and will be occupied by foreign troops. At the same time, Slovakia is witnessing thousands of people protesting against the policies of Fico's government. Slovakia is not Russia. In Russia, when Putin speaks, he speaks instead of and for all Russians. In a democratic country, people have the right to vote and a right to be heard. It's very important not to lose this right, and Slovakians need to work hard not to lose that. What else do we have? Serbian President Vucic, I will not impose sanctions on Russia or other friends. Speaking in Jagodina, Vucic reaffirmed Serbia's close ties with Russia and China. Of course, the Belt and Road Initiative is building a Chinese-funded railway from Serbia to Hungary. He added he will soon speak with Putin and address US sanctions on Serbia's oil industry. Then Vucic, the problem is not only that they want to overthrow me, the problem is that they, the opposition, want to destroy Serbia. And what we see in recent months is a direct demand of the foreign intelligence agencies to destroy our country. And of course, there have been these protests in Serbia, and I think Vucic's party has lost the majority there. And a major anti-corruption protest in Serbia add to pressure on Vucic. Tens of thousands rallied against the government and in memory of the railway station roof collapse that killed 15. It talks about corruption, the government being very corrupt, and lots of people getting fed up with them and coming out against Vucic. So that's the Eastern European lot. There's much more to say on Serbia. I mean, this whole article is very, very interesting. What are your thoughts, Jonathan?
It's all kicking off, isn't it? But I can see there are distinct patterns here from the capture, the state capture by parties that are not just pro-Moscow, but are acting against the interests of their own people. And they follow a playbook where they start with populist policies. They start often with, I would say, fairly backward-looking ideas. And this is quite an interesting one in Hungary, because we see Orban really siding with Moscow time after time after time, but he can also spin it internally to say that he's sort of defending the interests of his country against an overweening EU. He's winning revenue for his country. He's helping to keep the lights on, blah, 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 blah. There are ways in which he can spin it. There's a huge, for instance, historical reconstruction program in Hungary, replacing a lot of the buildings that were lost, during communism and the war. So you can see that these sort of populisms tied to other policies can create the illusion or the sense of stability, which some people will find attractive, despite maybe not even necessarily agreeing with some aspects of it. There comes a point, though, where that internal corruption starts to eat into the perception of them as a safe pair of hands. At that point, when they feel people turning against them, they turn to the next part of the playbook, which is what we see happening in Georgia, which is what we will see unfolding in Serbia. And that is where you resort to increasingly coercive measures. You start to deconstruct the checks and balances of the state. You accelerate the hollowing out of the judiciary. You start deploying brutish riot police who will disappear people from the street, go to their houses, beat them, search them, create spurious charges. There's a whole playbook of these techniques.
Well, actually, now that you say that, it's worth just throwing in what's going on in Georgia, because that's exactly what you're talking about. These Tatushkis are out in force. They're rounding up opposition leaders. They're beating people. This is what Georgians are going through in Tbilisi. That was on the 2nd yesterday, to reacquire the rights that the Russian-backed government has taken away, the same rights that Americans are currently pissing away. Arrest of more opposition. And Tbilisi, clashes between security forces and protesters continue. The action demanding new elections and a release of previously detained protesters turned into the detention of activists and opposition leaders, and later the beating of participants. And then what's going on in Georgia protests? Police violence on Tbilisi streets, as Euromaidan Press, escalates as the government attempts to slow boil the pro-EU protests. Multiple videos of police beating up protesters emerge. Here they beat up a lone demonstrator they just snatched. Violence comes as the pro-EU protesters attempted to attract more attention to their demands on day 67, new elections, and freeing 50 or so detained protesters by blocking the highway near the Tbilisi Mall at the entrance to the city.
We saw this unfolding in Russia, and let's face it, the scale of protests in Russia was small, even at the start of the full-scale war. But similar kind of techniques of making people isolated, shutting down media selectively, terrorizing, to expel voices from the country. So these are a set of techniques which are tried and tested, and where they start to fail, as in Belarus, well, you try some more techniques. And you tighten the vice, as it were, of violence that you're prepared to use, and it's a process of autocratic learning. How long will it be? And also, let's face it, this process is in the defense of not just parties that agree with Moscow. Usually, there are oligarchs behind it. So I've read some curious comments defending Elon Musk and saying, this is the thing you don't understand about Elon Musk and the American Constitution. Actually, oligarchs are the greatest bulwark against tyranny, which is a complete misunderstanding of how oligarchy and tyranny works. How long will it be before we see American Tatushki on the streets of Washington suppressing people in just this manner? I think we may be weeks away from seeing similar scenes across the US, frankly, because it's a playbook, it's a technique, it's a toolkit, and you can map the different stages of it and map them actually back to autocrats such as Putin, and how they share these techniques with their kindred spirits.
Yeah, and interesting that Julian Roster talks to what we said earlier, and thanks for the super chat here. It didn't take long for the obsequious Mandelson. So he's the Lord of the Dark guy with quite a long career in UK politics, was involved in the Blair administration. He has been touted for the ambassador to Washington, to the US, but he's also said some pretty negative things about Trump. He's then done the opposite of standing strong, because actually I kind of think he kind of has to apologize for that, or say he doesn't believe that anymore, that kind of thing, because otherwise they'd block him from being ambassador. I think the Americans can do that. So it's not like, it's quite difficult for him to stand up strong before he's even in that position. So, but yeah, so to doff the cap to Trump, should have sent Jeremy Corbyn or Red Ken just to annoy them. Interesting view there. And Tahir from Norway, thanks for that. Thanks for your work. Need some clear thoughts in this crazy time.
It's a nice idea, but I wouldn't want either of those two individuals to represent me. Thank you.
No, yes, yeah. I have like a begrudging respect for Mandelson. In respect's probably the wrong word. I think he could do a good job in that position, but also it could go the other way. I mean, it's, who knows? It's such a difficult landscape at the moment in which we're in. Before we go to a bit more geopolitics, just a few more super chats and whatnot. There's a question from Goose Springsteen, and this is more of a military one. Kaufman recently said, so this is Michael Kaufman, the military analyst, said that there is a perception in Ukraine that the infantry is for those too poorly educated or lacking in connections to get a better role. Have you heard any of this yourself in Ukraine? Interesting question. I think that's broadly the same the world over. I think general infantry, I mean, the officer corps in the UK has always been kind of Sandhurst, private school educated, etc. And there's a tendency for elitism in the officer corps, and it's much harder to move up through the ranks. It can be done, but it, that I don't think is an unusual perception to have within the armed forces.
I think there's something more interesting behind it. So I think this is a really powerful comment to put in here, but I think there's something far more subtle behind this. And that is that if you're someone who is, say, educated, who come from the technical background, and actually you do want to go into the army, you're going to want to make sure that you leverage the skills, in an outsized way. You're going to want to make sure that your impact in joining the army is more. If you wait to be conscripted, you'll be sent wherever, and you won't have a choice in that matter. You may be sent to one of the more effective battalions that has mastered combined arms, or who has a developed sense of drone warfare, or even a strategy towards attritional warfare. The chances are, though, you'll be sent to a battalion that doesn't have these things and may have more of a Soviet mindset, where your skills and impact is not going to be so great there. Your life may even be wasted on orders that turn out in hindsight to be mistaken or not well informed. So yes, if you're poor and if you're especially uneducated, that may be your lot. But if you really want to have an impact, because a lot of people still do, you're going to make sure you volunteer and that you have some choice in where you're sent. I think that's a really important nuance.
I think, sadly speaking, the sad truth is that being a frontline infantryman is going to be the least attractive job. You've got the highest probability of dying. You're going to be living in horrible conditions, in dugouts, in trenches, right? So, no one really wants to do that job. Let's be honest about it. I'm going to sign up to fight for my country, but those that were willing to go and do exactly that, they have now long been either attrited or in different positions now, whatever. So right now, if you have money and connections and actually you have skills like Jonathan was talking about that can act as leverage for good reason as well. There's no point using me as an infantryman when I can do electronics and soldering and make drones, right? So you are going. That is going to happen. Like the people with more connections and the ability to maneuver them outside of being an infantryman at the front lines, and they're more likely to get away from doing that job.
That's it. You don't want to leave it to chance, and you want to have the greatest impact you can. But of course, it's just a human thing. If you can join the armed forces, but also not be in a unit necessarily that's thrown into the sort of meat grinder straight away, of course you're going to want to do that. It's just a human thing. The other one is, you're going to want to join a battalion such as Azov. Not from the preconceptions people have from distorted media, because you're not joining a right-wing outfit. You're joining an outfit where people will have different points of view. There'll be some who are on the right, some on the left, some on the center, people with different identities, but they have a tighter command structure. They have been better at learning the lessons of warfare that is evolving in Ukraine, but also absorbing Western sort of combined arm techniques as well. So, of course, you want to go there.
You got the 3rd Assault Brigade, the 47th Assault Brigade, the Azov. There's a number of these units that have really good reputation for having hierarchical structures and organisation that are far better than some of the poorer units. And people will be clamouring to get to them. They'll then be able to cream off the better people, and it leads to a sort of polarisation, which might be problematic going forward. But that's
chances of survival and your chances of having an impact, and these are two things. I mean, let's also face it, there will be people who are conscripted who do not want to fight. Because who ultimately does? I mean, how many people in the Second World War wanted to do that in Britain rather than have families, work, learn their careers? I mean, it's not something that most people choose to do. So if you go into a battalion that has poor training and poor leadership, unfortunately, you're going to go into somewhere that can have very little support structure and can be pretty scary. This is just reality, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But this is a trope, and I just want to mention one thing here, as I just did a 2-hour in something called Lviv Media Forum, and this is one of these tropes, which is, why doesn't Ukraine? It's all so difficult. The suffering is so great. Why doesn't Ukraine just accept it's not getting its territory back and blah 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 and give up? Is essentially the direction of the trope, and I think this is not well understood. Still, even now, if Ukraine gives up, it ceases to exist. If Ukraine has stopped fighting, they individually cease to exist. Never mind culture, language, the possibility of living a fulfilling life and either pursuing money or career or whatever. All these things are gone. People who came from Donetsk, who knew how that was parts of its economy were rapidly evolving and modernizing, and how that was all destroyed by the Russian invasion. Ukrainians understand that it's not just about surviving, but it's about living free and being able to develop your talents. All that is gone. All that has gone under Russian occupation. So I think this needs to be hammered home, because it's not really sunk in with a lot of people.
Thank you very much, Mr. Liondas, for the super sticker. Very kind of you. Another Michael Kaufman, Goose Springsteen comment. So on the Kaufman train again, but he's also said that he thinks unrecoverable losses of killed in action, missing in action, and disabled are approximately 40% of the headline daily figure given. So what I think your man is referring to is the Ukrainian general staff figure. They say, for example, today's numbers were 1,300. Casualties, but casualties include quite a wide range of sort of different categories. You're dead, you're injured, you're deserters, you're POWs. And what Kaufman, I presume here, is then saying is that of 1,300, 40% of them are unrecoverable. They've lost them for good. The other 60% will get reconstituted back into the armed forces probably sooner rather than later, because the Russians have a propensity to throw in very injured people back into.
Let's talk about Russia here, not Ukraine, is it? Because Ukraine doesn't release these figures. So,
yeah, exactly. I presume exactly that. Yeah, for that reason. And so the Russians will be reconstituting a lot of those that are deemed as lost, and that's why we see people with crutches on the battlefields and so on and so forth.
We've seen those videos. I mean, how effective these people are going to be, and I've listened to a lot of them in the original Russian. I mean, these people are not going to be effective warriors at all. They're simply fodder. They're not going to achieve anything tactical or strategic.
Yep, Christopher here says, have seen a light. Trump is God. MAGA, MAGA, MAGA. I have a feeling that might be tongue very clearly in the cheek there, knowing him. Goose, his last one on, oh no, not that one. Last one here from Goose on Kaufman. Regarding European strategic autonomy, it's going to take a massive investment. It was easier for the US to get military equipment to Ukraine from the West Coast than for France. This is absolutely true. You've had, I think, Latvia coming out today. In fact, I could probably find this somewhere. There we go. I've got it up on the screen there. Oh, that's very fortuitous. So here we have Latvia saying Europe won't be able to help Ukraine without increasing defense spending. We see that we cannot help Ukraine unless we spend more on defense, and this is needed for Europe and not just for Ukraine. So again, there's two things there. One, they need to spend more, and two, Ukraine is part of Europe's strategy. Like, helping Ukraine is not a charity. Helping Ukraine is in Europe's best strategic interest, as I've argued for the US, although Trump, I think, sees things somewhat differently. So absolutely agree, Goose. It will take a huge commitment. The question is, are the Europeans adequately scared enough at the moment to actually do the right thing? Are they thinking in terms of Europe's own existential future? And I think they should be. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that.
No, and is there a sign that these investments are being made? Well, some early signs, but we're 3 years into this now. We're entering the fourth year. Clearly, it's not happened nearly fast enough. The other one we can mention is Trump's my economics and math is not great, as you discovered when we were talking a bit more. But Trump's saying that the European countries or NATO members should go to 5% of GDP. In my mind, I thought that's 5% of governmental budgets, but of course it's not, because GDP is a much larger number than the annual budget of a given government. And I read a quote from a German politician saying 5% of their GDP would equate to more than half of the federal budget per annum.
Something like
and of course, that's nuts.
But yeah,
it's nuts. Of course, it's not going to happen. Jumping from whatever it is now, 10% or whatever, I don't know what the figures are, but jumping from that to half of all federal spending. And I would assume that pattern would play out in many European countries as well.
That's a really good point, Jonathan, because at the moment, the US spends, something like 3.23%, something like that, on defense, and they spend something like almost $900 billion a year, right? So if they go from 3.23% to 5% themselves, right? I don't think Trump can say, oh, I'll spend 5%, but the US can't do that. The US would be spending obscene, like it's not quite doubling, but it will be like suddenly having to find another like $600 billion to spend on defense. Never going to do that.
It would be a level of militarization unprecedented since the Second World War, and quite extraordinary. I mean, if you look at the figures as well of who was producing what in the Second World War, obviously it was some of the key powers involved: Germany, France, Britain, etc. Whereas France didn't produce an awful lot because it was under occupation. So, its investment in military sort of went down in comparison in the Second World War, as a power that was occupied. But the kind of rearmament process we're talking about here, it would be reminiscent of what's happening in the late 1930s. The trouble when you produce this much armament, and this is one of the reasons why I think Putin thought he could go to war, because he had all the kit. If you produce this much stuff, I think it makes the likelihood of confrontation worse, actually, in the world. So there's several different angles to feel fearful about.
Yes, it is. Well, we live in a time to be fearful about pretty much everything. I was going to just say another couple of thanks, if you don't mind, Jonathan. 5 ATP Geopolitics memberships. Thanks to Richard Bennett. Very kind, new members and whatnot. Mark Bisque, legend that is Mark, and thanks, Mark, for all of your support for the channel and this as well. So glad to see you both safe. It is amusing for me how a lot of Trump fans in Canada are now walking around with the same dumbfounded expression. I think with time the shock will turn to horror and rage. It's really interesting, and there is undoubtedly going to be a lot of cognitive dissonance when you have a core belief in your head and you have evidence against that belief that causes dissonance, and then your brain wants to do cognitive dissonance reduction to get rid of that dissonance. There's going to be a belief in Canada, for example, and I went and saw my dad today, right? And my dad is your arch Brexiteer, completely different end of the political spectrum to me, and as said for many months, I mean, he's getting dementia now, but he said for many, many months, oh, I love Trump, and half of it's him saying that to piss me off. But also, I went round today, and I just opened up with, oh my God, I think Trump's a dick, right? And I just said that to my parents, like, because they had the news on, and they was talking about the trade war, and I was like, that, and my mum went, yeah, absolutely, completely agree, and my dad was like, yeah, like I think he had kind of got to a point where even with where he's at mentally at the moment, where it's like, yeah, I'm not sure he's doing the right thing. Now that's big, but there's going to be a lot of people who will be trying to justify how what Trump is doing is a good thing, either as a Canadian or as an American thinking of foreign policy and diplomacy and the war with Ukraine. You can be a Trump supporter and a Ukraine supporter. How do you feel about what's all going on here when he's starting with against all of his allies, but not having a go at Russia and China? China gets 10% tariffs and Canada gets 25% tariffs. So Mark Bisque is going to, for sure, know a bunch of people who are going to be going through this kind of cognitive dissonance.
And it's a challenge because even if someone, let's say on the Republican side, doesn't agree with everything that Trump does, blah, 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 and they're pro-Ukrainian, part of them is going to want to think, well, hang on a second, Biden didn't really help Ukraine that much. You had people who are influenced by Russian narratives, who had a way into the national security team. You had the whole, scandals around Hunter Biden, all this kind of stuff. There are reasons to think, well, hang on a second, like you keep going about Russia, blah, 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 blah. Well, aren't the Democrats also, in hoc to Russia and blah, blah, blah? So you can take this and you can turn this into a weaponized narrative. Unfortunately, those people, and I speak to many of them and I count many of them as friends, they're going to resist the idea that Trump is acting in the interests of the Kremlin until it's too late. They're already doing that. I had this argument about US aid, and you can see the argument, like something needed to be done and no one's done it for decades and there's lack of transparency and Washington, blah, blah, blah. And you can say, okay, there's something to be said for that, but not for the way it's being done. And then there was the phrase, yes, but, it's just 90 days. And then those programs that are worthy of funding, once the due diligence has been done, they'll get it back again. And I'm like, no, that's not what's happening here. The US government is being eviscerated. US aid will not come back. Once it's gone, it will not come back. And it's not just an efficiency measure. It is a form of nihilism against international order and the very concept of democracy globally, advancing it.
It is absolutely not efficiency, because the person that's at the heart of it, Elon Musk, is saying that it's run by a bunch of Marxist radicals. And so this is ideological. It is not about efficiency. And this is about stripping out that funding for what they see as some kind of lefty thing. No, this is the soft power that the US has. This is how you gain traction around the world. And they've turned it off like that. And the people that seem to be in charge of all this are unelected Mr. Musk and his interns of 19 to 24-year-olds, 6 of them apparently, now have access to all of the sensitive data of all the people and all the monies in the United States. Like, what the hell is going on? Like when Hillary Clinton and Benghazi and the email server was going on, Republicans were going absolutely mental about that. This is like that times 5,000.
Oh, it's on a whole other scale, and not a peep.
Why are they not angry? Why are they not angry? What people out there listening to me who are Republicans did any of you say anything on social media about Hillary Clinton's emails? If you ever, any of you out there said anything about Hillary Clinton's emails, but haven't spat the dummy about what Elon Musk is doing at the moment in the middle of the government, and having control over all of the data, then you are a complete hypocrite. You're just a hypocrite. I'm sorry to attack my own viewers, but if that is where you're at, there's some interesting psychology going on inside your head.
And you are gloriously participating in the demolition of American governance and all the processes and checks and balances that underpin it, never mind the impact on strategic interests of the US around the world. It is an extraordinary kind of trick. Anyone who's read Bismanov or seen the interviews with him will say, goodness, how did this come to pass? Because we are living in this absolutely topsy-turvy world. For those who are saying this isn't really an issue, this is the complete privatization of the government by an unelected group who is run by an oligarch who has credible connections to relatives and associates who are paid up members of the Canadian Nazi Party. But even if you look at him as a sort of tech, a sort of crypto tech bro kind of oligarch, that is disturbing enough, because he now is going full pelt in moving the US Treasury onto a blockchain model, which is a form of, I call it a crypto coup, actually. It's moving the US towards becoming the fiefdom of an oligarch, including all its mechanisms of finance and payment. But the US aid thing is extraordinary, by releasing these details, plus the details of NGOs, who's been paid where, what, when, what they were paid for. that means not only are the recipients of this, the services that are provided by these NGOs now at risk, but anyone who was associated with the NGOs or worked with them, or the founders, are now at risk. This also includes American agents and assets around the world who are working hard on American interests globally. All their identities and purposes are potentially now leaked and exposed. Nothing like this has happened before. Again, if people were angry about Hillary Clinton's emails, if they were angry about Snowden, for goodness sake, well, this is a whole other order of magnitude more than Edward Snowden. It's an absolute betrayal of US interests. And yeah, but I hold no, I'm not holding my breath about people recognizing this.
My good Canadian friend Mitch Mazarol, JP and JF, glad to see you both back, safe and more or less sound. Thanks for your tireless efforts. Thank you, Mitch, for your tireless support. So it really does mean a lot. And my goodness, you are in the United States of Canada right now to be.
51st state, yeah.
51st
well, I need a
state.
visa to visit. That's the question.
So for those British viewers, mainly British, because I doubt many people they have played in America, but there's a band called New Model Army. Now, New Model Army are an awesome band, love them, and they had a song, "The 51st State." We are the 51st state of America. It's an absolutely great song. It just applies to Canada now, not the UK. Okay, so. Thanks to Rob Tyree for your membership. Glory and victory to Slavo Ukraine, Slavo Ukraine. Right. What do we have? I think Goose is explaining an earlier one. Kaufman said the size of the possible EU UK peacekeeping force, I know this is different, is likely no more than 40,000 in total. Fact in rotations, and you'd have about 15,000 similar to Bosnia in the 90s, which is woefully inadequate for a 1,200 kilometer front.
Yes.
I don't know the numbers needed here, but you will need a substantial force. It depends what their job role would be and how. I mean, there's an awful lot to hammer out here with an international peacekeeping force.
I read somewhere, and I can't honestly remember where, but a properly deterrent force, which Putin would actually be concerned about, would be between 300,000 and 500,000. That's right. The scale of force required. Well, I'm not sure we have that available, and I'm not sure we have the equipment that would be required to protect and equip such a force.
Yeah, German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock has support. She's from the Green Party coalition at the moment. It depends what goes on. There's obviously going to be elections soon, so this might be an irrelevant belief. But although the Greens might go into coalition with CDU, so I don't know. But she's a really strong supporter of Ukraine. She has support for international peacekeepers in post-war Ukraine. She suggested a potential deployment of the Bundeswehr troops as part of the international peacekeeping force in Ukraine after the war ends. That would have to be passed through the Bundestag, because that would, I think, require a change in the constitution, or at least a change into German law, or they have to seek permission. They can't just. It's not like other countries where you can send your troops without getting permission from the government. So, but that's good to see that she's on board with that. Johnny Nedregard, thanks for the membership. And thank you very much for your support there with your Norwegian love. Rob Tyree is gifted 5 ATP Geopolitics membership, so thank you very much for that. Stephen Bendel, I need to get you on the channel, Stephen. He's got a Ukrainian wife from Norway. The free world must and will learn to cope without the US. We can do it if we stick together. Interesting. So some people are calling on Norway have given an absolute bunch of money to Ukraine, and they've upped it massively for this next year. And they've done that on pressure from the opposition at the moment. The right-wing opposition has put pressure on, and the government has said, yeah, well, we agree to this. There's a general consensus that because they made a load of money out of the price of oil as a result of the war in Ukraine, the energy crisis, their sovereign wealth fund, due to the North Sea oil reserves, the war in Ukraine made Norway a bunch of money. So they've upped the amount. They've given like one of the best in the world in terms of per capita and et cetera to Ukraine. But there are some calling for them to give even more because of that direct link of all that money to the war in Ukraine. And I was wondering, like, the way you do this, I was thinking Norway should essentially just replace all of its hardware. Just say, right, okay, we are going to do that, but we're going to do it in a way that benefits Norway, because you've got to think of yourself as well. So I would just right. We're going to replace all of our, all of the aging equipment we might have in every single context, and all of the old stuff we give to Ukraine. So we're going to have, and we're going to. I don't know if they have any F-16s anymore. Just get rid of all the F-16s and get Gripens in from Sweden, and rely on Europe. Get all the old stuff to Ukraine, and then use a sovereign wealth fund to do that, rather than taking a sovereign wealth fund and buy stuff from outside of Norway, or to give stuff to Ukraine directly, like money to Ukraine directly. Just use that to absolutely upgrade the Norwegian armed forces to the absolute hilt, so they've got the best kit in the world, and then all that old kit, give it to Ukraine. So anyway, that would be my idea, for what it's worth. You're on mute, but I don't know if you've got anything to add. The last one here from Goose Springsteen says UK defence spending was 5% of GDP in the mid-80s. The problem today is we spend so much more on pensions and healthcare with much worse demographics.
Yeah,
it is broadly
absolutely,
true,
yeah.
but it's just the way society's gone. Right, we're getting older, and we like to make people live longer because that's kind of Hippocratic oath and all that. The problem is all countries are suffering with a demographic shift from more of a pyramid or a triangle to something that looks a bit more like that, which means you have fewer people down at the bottom to sustain more people up the top. The UK is no different there, and so therefore everything is more expensive. Everything is more expensive. As in welfare, the government, running a government is more expensive now than it used to be. And that's just the way it is, right? And it's not the fault of any government. It's not the fault of any political party. It is how society is progressing. Now, China and UK and every country in the world that is a developed nation or developing nation is going to have to deal with this. And that means, we are going to be competing to spend less money on more things, and but we spend more money on fewer things, etc., etc. So
this is an interesting one, isn't it? Is like, have mature democracies moved beyond large scale imperial wars just because of the flow of history, or because the demographics are pushing us in that way? And that if truly you have representative democracy, it's not really conducive to large-scale mobilization like we saw in World War II, which was largely the war of young people being played out. Russia has no such democratic mechanisms, and this is the point probably that's drawn us both to sort of doing this sort of stuff, which is that in an increasingly aging world with resources. There we go. We recognize this chap here. Because because of the status of resources and demographics, democracies won't be led to this. But those countries that do not have that feedback mechanism, they react to crisis by doing what Putin's done, doubling down, retrenching their positions, defending their positions as autocrats by starting wars and provocations. It leads me to think that, the survival of humanity itself is intrinsically linked to democracy being more widespread. But we see in times of crisis that actually democracy is in abeyance. And this is maybe one of the biggest challenges of our time.
Yeah, absolutely. Interesting that EU is preparing for a trade war with the US, but we need to understand that China will be the winner. Kaya Kallas there, who is absolutely on point, as she always seems to be at the moment. Absolutely. You have loads of time for Kaya Kallas. I think she's a really smart cookie.
This is one we do in the next live stream, but there is a report, I need to find out if this is true, that outside Beijing, China is building a advanced military planning center
10 times the size of the Pentagon.
10 times the size of the Pentagon. So again, do you do that just for the fun of it, or do you do it because you feel that you're going to be using it? Yeah, that's kind of scary. We'll unpack that in the next one.
Yeah, and maybe this to finish off with for today, my good friend Mr. Fink. But here is an interesting one that hopefully could be a kick in the balls for Russia. So Kazakhstan has found a way around Russia's oil dominance. A massive Kashagan field sent its first shipment via Azerbaijan, aiming to slash Russian transit by 80%. 13 billion barrels of oil will now flow west without Moscow's control. And this might also pertain, or not necessarily pertain to, but there's added to that would be the one from Qatar going through Syria, as you can see there. That now that Russia are not in Syria, that's one of the reasons why they were in Syria. You can argue is they didn't want that pipeline to be constructed across Syria, now all connected. So you might get several alternatives to Russian oil that will allow the EU nations to continue to take oil from the east, but not from Russia. And of course, that is exactly what the EU wants. So that could be an interesting development.
Or have they just accelerated their position on who's next list of the Kremlin's military acquisitions?
Interesting. Yeah. Who knows? But all of this. Well, yeah, I think this kind of sums up Viggo Holmsen. The tripolar world is coming into focus here, and that's kind of it. I mean, you talked previously, Jonathan, about this multipolarity, and you can argue what the what the teams are, but it seems that the US might just have just cut one of the teams in half. And now we may well have the EU standing in some kind of opposition, somewhat aligned to the US, but really at a little bit of with a little bit of friction going on there. And then you've got BRICS maybe, and then you've got the Middle East. You know what? Where are they going to?
Yeah, I'm not sure BRICS can be defined as a block. It's so disparate and has no, really military commonality between it. It's going to be China, US, and EU, with Britain floating on the edge of that, and India, perhaps doing its own thing, benefiting where it can, making alliances where it can. I think we'll see a lot of countries that are nominally aligned with more than one of these sort of tripolar sort of stool legs, or whatever you want to call them.
Well, it's interesting you talk about BRICS being an uneasy partnership, and it is. It's a marriage of convenience, and a lot of them don't really like each other. So India and China don't get on particularly well. China and Russia don't actually get on that well. And now there's a lot of kickback inside Russia that they really are a vassal state of China, which we knew that they were going to be. That dependency is there, and they're not going to like it, but they've got no choice. But there is that resentment, and the same for India and Russia don't particularly get on. So it's interesting how the new railroad China is building through the countries south of Russia will undermine Russia and extend China's influence and dominance in the region, all part of a larger plan. Yeah. So again, I've said previously that Russia losing this war isn't necessarily to the isn't a negative for China. I think China gain if Russia win the war, and China gain if Russia lose the war. They can gain in different ways, but I think if Russia lose, China goes in, helps themselves to all the natural resources, gets Russia back up on its feet as a mate, but really it's to the benefit of China, and they're doing things that do not benefit Russia very directly.
I think it was Samuel Sharper. Someone wrote this book, Everyone Loses, when talking about such a crisis, but somebody always wins. Somebody always comes out on top. And in this case, really, China could emerge stronger while everybody else emerges far weaker, politically, economically, and in terms of their cohesion.
And given that, BRICS was only created to oust US hegemony, so the supreme power of the US, says Viggo Holmsen, but isn't it funny how it's the US that seems to have ousted their own hegemony, or at least are intent on doing so, with this kind of isolationist, anti-allied approach of Donald Trump and his the people in his backrooms. Donald Trump, I don't think, is behind all this. I think there's a lot of backroom staff that are Steve Bannon-esque type people that have got these longer term plans going on.
Stephen Miller.
Stephen Miller and other such people. So I wonder what the history books will say about who was pulling the strings and when and where. So I guess that's a massive thanks to everyone in the stream who has supported us. Thank you very, very much. An interesting contradiction is Orban's relationship with China. Hungary is essentially China's springboard in Europe and the EU, and Orban's relationship with the US is under Trump. I thought there's going to be much more of a tension because Orban was on China's side, and previously Trump was very anti-China in his rhetoric, but it seems like he's not all that much against China. Like he's anti-Taiwan. He's given China 2.5 times less of the tariffs than he has his friendly neighbor Canada. So I don't know. I think probably China and Orban can continue to be best mates there. So.
He has more to lose, and if he fully falls out with China, more to win if he can place leverage on them. So as mad as it seems, maybe there's some strategy there. But well, let's try and keep on top of this, and let's meet again, and maybe see if we can get a guest to join us later in the week.
Absolutely. Thank you to those who are thanking us. It's been good to get back with Jonathan again. It's been too long, only a couple of days, and I miss him dearly. So it's been wonderful. I appreciate this, and good to have Mark, who's absolutely integral to our team out there in Ukraine from the Little Whiskey Shop. Remember, if you have any whiskey or gin or spirits or wine needs in the UK, check out the Little Whiskey Shop in Stockbridge, and then it'll make me feel better about how wonderful Mark was in supporting our endeavors out there. Do you have any
absolute rock, wasn't he? You know, whenever things went a bit south, Mark was steadying the ship.
He was nothing if not a very consistent driver as well on our way out there, and when we got to Lviv. So thanks, Mark, Ledge. Any last words, Mr. Fink?
No, except this is the tidal wave, an absolute fire hydrant of nonsense that is being spewed out every day. So we'll try to stay on top of it. We'll try to interpret it, and we'll try to bring it to people where we can.
We're here for it. Yeah, absolutely. We're here for fire hydrants and nonsense. Awesome stuff. Well, take care, everybody. Toodle Pips, really appreciate you guys. Good to be back in the live chair. And we'll speak to you soon at another point during this week at some point.
Hopefully, yep.
Take care, y'all.